Sorry, I had an interruption during the recording of the lecture, and I will talk about the remaining part of my lecture in this segment. So in this segment, I will talk about the posterior compartment. The posterior compartment of the leg, it lies posterior to the interosseous membrane, posterior to the posterior surface of the tibia and the fibula. And the large posterior compartment of the leg, it has a superficial part and it has a deep part. The superficial part of the posterior compartment of the leg has three muscles mainly: the two-headed gastrocnemius, and the soleus, and a very small muscle, the plantaris. And these muscles, these form the prominence of the cuff, which is a prominent part of the back of the leg. And this prominence of the cuff muscles is human characteristics for human upright position. And these cuff muscles are large and strong and heavy because they accelerate, they propel and the foot during standing, walking, running, and jumping. And the two-headed gastrocnemius, it has a lateral head and it has a medial head. The lateral and medial head of the gastrocnemius, they attach to the lateral and medial condyles of the femur. And these two-headed gastrocnemius, they form together with the soleus muscle, they form a large tendon, which is the calcaneal tendon or tendoachilles. And soleus muscle, it is a large flat muscle. It deep to the gastrocnemius muscle. It resembles, it looks like sole of the foot. That's why it is called soleus muscle. Soleus muscle is attached superiorly at the soleal line of the tibia, and plantaris is another small muscle which is attached to the lateral condyle of the femur along with the lateral head of the gastrocnemius. And all these muscles together, these form a large tendon, which is one of the body's strongest tendon, the calcaneal tendon or tendoachilles. Achilles tendon or tendocalcaneus is attached to the calcaneal tuberosity. And this is called Achilles tendon. Names come from the name of a Greek god. Achilles is one of the Greek god. And calcaneal tendon is one of the strongest tendon, and it together with this tendon, these muscles, they produces the plantar flexion of the sole of the foot. Plantar flexion means raising of the heel of the foot and standing on the toes. The gastrocnemius, soleus, and plantaris, they produces the plantar flexion, and deep to this muscle there is the deep compartment, deep muscles of the back of the leg. And the deep muscles of the back of the leg, it includes three muscles from lateral to medial: the flexor digitorum longus, the tibialis posterior, and flexor hallucis longus. These three deep muscles, they lie deep to the soleus muscle. See here, the soleus muscle is cut and reflected. But there is another muscles include in the deep part of the posterior compartment of the leg, that is called popliteus. Popliteus muscle is a flat triangular muscle. It lies above the attachment of the soleus muscle. And popliteus muscle, it lies above the attachment of the soleus muscle over the proximal part of the posterior aspect of the tibia. And it forms, at this point, it forms the inferior part of the floor of the popliteal fossa. So see, this is the soleal line, which gives attachment to the soleus muscle. And above this line, this is the attachment of the popliteal muscle on the popliteal surface of the tibia. And at this point, it forms the floor of the popliteal fossa, inferior part of the floor of the popliteal fossa. And popliteus muscle tendon, it courses superiorly and it passes through the capsule of the knee joint. The tendon of the popliteus muscle is intracapsular, and finally it is attached to the side of the lateral condyle of the femur. Popliteus muscle is It helps in unlocking of the knee joint. When we stand on our foot, when we stand, our knee is in extended position, and that position, the extended position of the knee, is a stable position. And if we want to move from that position, we need to unlock the knee. And this popliteus muscle, it unlocks the knee joint, and it produces 5-degree, a little bit of lateral rotation first. That is called the unlocking of the knee joint. And popliteus muscle does that. So that's why it is called unlocking muscle. And after that popliteus muscle unlocks the knee joint, we can move our knee joint. So popliteus, flexor digitorum longus, flexor hallucis longus, and tibialis posterior. These are the muscles of the deep part of the posterior compartment of the leg. From lateral to medial, laterally the flexor digitorum longus. Flexor digitorum longus, it has 4 tendons. The tendons of the 4 tendons of the flexor digitorum longus going to the distal phalanx, plantar surface or the sole of the foot, going to the distal phalanx of the lateral 4 toes. Flexor digitorum longus, it is the flexor of the lateral 4 toes. And then the tibialis posterior. The tibialis posterior is a small muscle. It lies in its proximal part in between the flexor digitorum longus and the flexor hallucis longus. But the tibialis posterior tendon, it passes behind the medial malleolus and enters into the plantar surface of the foot. And tibialis posterior muscle, it crosses the sole of the foot from the medial side of the foot to the lateral side of the foot. And tibialis posterior tendon has an extensive attachments to the plantar surface of the bones of the foot. It is attached to the navicular, cuboid, the cuneiforms, cuboid, and also to the bases of the metatarsal bones. And because of the attachment of the tibialis posterior, and tibialis anterior is also attached to the medial cuneiform and the base of the first metatarsal bone, these tibialis anterior and tibialis posterior, these are attached to the medial side of the foot. That's why these are the inverters of the foot. And you know that inversion means raising of the medial border of the foot. Flexor hallucis longus is the most lateral muscle in the deep part of the posterior compartment of the leg. Flexor hallucis longus is larger than the flexor digitorum longus. But flexor hallucis longus tendon is also passing posterior to the medial malleolus. And these tendons, the flexor digitorum longus, tibialis posterior, flexor hallucis longus, these are lying inferior or behind the medial malleolus, and they are binding together by a thickening of the fascia, which is called the flexor retinaculum. Flexor hallucis longus tendon is going under the sustentaculum tali of the calcaneus, and it goes all the way up to the distal phalanx of the great toe. See, this is the tendon of the flexor hallucis longus, and while it is passing under the head of the first metatarsal bone, it passes in between the 2 sesamoid bones, and it is going all the way up to the distal phalanx of the great toe. Hallux means great toe, so flexor hallucis longus, it is the long flexor of the great toe, and which is reinforced. There is a flexor hallucis longus, another small muscle in the sole of the foot, which helps in the flexion of the great toe. And the flexor digitorum longus, these are the flexures of the lateral 4 toes. But flexor digitorum longus, although it moves the lateral 4 toes, but it is smaller than the flexor hallucis longus. The artery of the posterior compartment of the leg is the posterior tibial artery. The posterior tibial artery is one of the terminal branch of the popliteal artery. See the popliteal artery? Popliteal artery enters into the posterior compartment of the leg over the popliteus muscle first, and then it courses with the tibial nerve, and it lies in between the superficial and deep muscles of the posterior compartment of the leg. At the distal border of the popliteus muscle, here, at the distal border of the popliteus muscle, the popliteal artery is dividing into two branches. It divides into two branches. The larger terminal branch is the posterior tibial artery and the smaller one is the anterior tibial artery. The anterior tibial artery is passing through the gap or opening superior to the interosseous membrane. And already I mentioned that anterior tibial artery is passing through the gap over the interosseous membrane, and then it enters into the anterior compartment, and anterior tibial artery supplies the muscles of the anterior compartment. The posterior tibial artery courses with the tibial nerve in between the superficial and deep muscles of the posterior compartment of the leg. The posterior tibial artery, it courses all the way. It's going behind the medial malleolus. Then posterior tibial artery, at this point, it gives rise to plantar arteries. The medial and lateral plantar arteries, they are entering into the plantar surface of the foot, and the lateral plantar artery forms the deep plantar arterial arch, which is completed by a deep plantar branch of the dorsalis pedis artery. So posterior tibial artery is the artery of the posterior compartment of the leg. Posterior tibial artery gives rise another large branch that is called fibular artery. The fibular artery coursing through the flexor hallucis longus muscle, and fibular artery, it supplies the posterior compartment. Also, there are some perforating branches of the fibular artery which passes through the interosseous membrane, and the perforating branches of the fibular artery supply the posterior compartment. Also, they supply the lateral compartment of the leg, which contains the fibularis longus and fibularis brevis muscle. They do not have any individual blood supply, any individual artery. They get their blood supply from the perforating branches of the fibular artery. In the lab, to identify the posterior tibial artery, remember that it courses with the tibial nerve always. And posterior tibial artery and tibial nerve, they are both passing behind the medial malleolus, and they are covered by the flexor retinaculum, the thickening of the deep fascia. And the tibial nerve, the terminal branch of the sciatic nerve, it is passing through the popliteal fossa. It enters into the posterior compartment of the leg, and on the posterior compartment of the leg, it lies in between the superficial and deep flexor muscles. The tibial nerve supplies all the muscles of the posterior compartment of the leg. All superficial and deep muscles of the posterior compartment of the leg get the nerve supply from the tibial nerve, no exceptions. I already mentioned that the tendons of the tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, flexor hallucis longus, and the posterior tibial artery and tibial nerve, these structures are passing behind the medial malleolus. And behind the medial malleolus, all these structures are binding together by a thickening of the fascia that is called flexor retinaculum. And under the flexor retinaculum, these structures has a relation. And you can remember this relation by a mnemonic which we called Tom, Dick, and Harry. The T of the Tom stands for the tendon of the tibialis posterior, that is the first one and the most medial structure passing behind the medial malleolus. And then the D of the Dick, that is the tendon of the flexor digitorum longus. A for the posterior tibial artery, N for the tibial nerve, and H of Harry is for the tendon of the flexor hallucis longus. So tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, posterior tibial artery, the tibial nerve, and the flexor hallucis longus tendon. These are the structures under the flexor retinaculum behind the medial malleolus, and this relation is important. So this is the summary of all the leg muscles, blood vessels, and nerves, and in the different compartments. So anterior compartment has these muscles, and these muscles are the dorsiflexors of the ankle joint and the extensors of the toes, and anterior compartment muscles get the nerve supply from the deep fibular nerve and blood supply from the anterior tibial artery and vein. The smallest lateral compartment has the two fibularis muscle, the fibularis longus and fibularis brevis, and the nerve supply of this muscle is from the superficial fibular nerve, and these muscles are the everters of the foot. And the large posterior compartment has the superficial muscles, the gastrocnemius and the soleus, and the deep muscles includes the tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, flexor hallucis longus, and all these muscles of the posterior compartment of the leg get their nerve supply from the tibial nerve and blood supply from the posterior tibial artery, which lies deep to the transverse intermuscular septum in between the superficial and deep compartment of the posterior compartment of the leg. And the posterior tibial artery has a fibular branch, and that fibular branch of the posterior tibial artery that supply the posterior compartment. Also, the perforating branches of the posterior tibial artery supply the perforating branch of the fibular artery supply the lateral compartment muscles. So this is the summary, and all the muscles of the posterior compartment of the leg, they are the plantar flexors of the ankle joint, and they are the flexors of the toes. Thank you.